I think that that nation states are just collections of people, and people experience FOMO, and nation states will have it too. We spend money on a lot of dumb things as a country, and this is something that we could spend money on that would help preserve our capacity as a world leader in the event that, for some reason, for the likely reason that other monies or other countries see that Bitcoin is a superior form of money and they want access to it too. One of the nice things about Senator Lummis's act is the 20-year statutory, what I call statutory HODL period, where the act requires any Bitcoin that is put into the Bitcoin reserve to be held by the Treasury Department for a minimum of 20 years. And when you think about what that means, I mean, Bitcoin is only 16 years old.
This podcast is entertainment, not financial, tax, or legal advice. Views expressed represent statements of the speaker in their individual capacity, do not represent the views of Unchained, and should not be considered investment advice. Speakers often have personal, family, or business connections to Unchained, which may include direct financial benefits. Please see our disclosure at unchained.com/podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bitcoin Frontier. This week we have on Bryan Jacoutot. Bryan, welcome.
Hey, good to be back on the Bitcoin Frontier podcast and hanging out for another quick rip with Joe Burnett.
Absolutely. We're glad to have you. And I think, now is very timely to have an episode talking about, what's going on with strategic Bitcoin reserve, regulatory landscape, and so much more.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's very good, very interesting time as an attorney to be kind of watching all this stuff. Attorney that's kind of policy focused as well. Seeing all this movement in DC and in the state houses is very exciting for me because I can actually do something for the industry instead of just kind of watching and commentating. So that's always a plus.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk about the Bitcoin strategic reserve at a federal level, and we're definitely going to get into that. But before we do that, is there anything that's, on the horizon or on the radar that you're kind of excited about that you think most people aren't paying attention to right now?
If we're talking about something that I don't know if people are paying attention to yet, I mean, there's a lot of things that are exciting in the regulatory world, but they may be kind of well versed in those areas. So the one thing I think that maybe people wouldn't necessarily be aware of is the Trump administration's, I guess, sort of viewpoint on how the federal regulatory agencies should respond to the political side of the executive branch, so meaning the side that's elected, so President Trump himself. Federal agencies historically are very entrenched, and they have lifelong bureaucrats often at the helm. You'll have a political appointee at the top, but much of what is in the federal agency itself are lifelong bureaucrats, and they have kind of their own ways of doing things, and they do their own thing from administration to administration. But at the end of the day, these agencies are largely executive creatures. They do have a linkage to the Congress as well, because a lot of times there's enabling legislation that creates them, but they're executive federal agencies. And the viewpoint that the Trump administration is kind of taking with that is that they need to be directly responsive to the political branch, i.e. the president of the United States. And that means a lot for our industry right now, because President Trump is looking at Bitcoin and cryptocurrency more broadly very favorably as compared to President Biden, President Obama, and even President Trump 1.0 in his first term. I think he was much more, I think he was at best probably a neutral kind of onlooker. I don't think he was particularly very negative toward it. But now he's positive towards it, and he wants to kind of cultivate it and support it. So him taking that kind of route with respect to federal agencies, the federal regulatory agencies, is interesting, and we'll see how it plays out, because it's not necessarily etched in stone that is the correct legal way to go about it, but it certainly has legal support, and that'll probably be fought out in the courts and in the agencies over the next few months and years. But it's certainly very interesting, and to the extent that it is carried out, I think it's a net positive for our industry in particular, due to how President Trump views cryptocurrency these days.
Yeah, you made a really good point. Like, thinking back to his last presidency, like he kind of did have like a negative or at best neutral position on Bitcoin. And now it's like we're talking about a potential Bitcoin strategic reserve at a federal level. So things have changed quite fast. I want to ask you about the strategic reserve. Like right now, we have, potential executive actions. We have the Senator Cynthia Lummis bill that's been drafted, at least initially. Like, but I think a lot of people, they don't really know much beyond hearing those kind of, highlights and understanding that, okay, the United States might buy Bitcoin and put it in a strategic reserve, or they might move existing Bitcoin and put it in a strategic reserve. So like, maybe can you kind of like, start out at like a high level of like, what are the different paths to like achieving a strategic reserve, and like whether it's the bill or executive order, like, broadly, like how are you thinking about it right now?
Yeah. So I think there's going to need to be kind of at the federal level alone, let alone we put aside the state level for right now. At the federal level, you're going to have probably two parallel tracks. On the one hand, again, because President Trump has been so vocal, both on the campaign trail and through his early executive order on digital assets, he's been so vocal about supporting the industry and the idea of a potentially Bitcoin only strategic reserve, or possibly now he's talking about throwing some others in there, which we don't need to talk about the wisdom of that decision at all. But he's certainly very receptive to the idea, and I think he wants to make it happen in relatively short order because he wants action. He's a guy who wants action, as you've seen over the last 8 years of him kind of being in the political public eye. And the easiest way to do that is through executive order. The problem, of course, with executive orders is they can be overturned or changed by an executive order from a future administration. So they don't necessarily have a great deal of staying power. And no one has illustrated that better than President Trump himself, because the day he walked in the door, he took all of Biden's quote unquote policy achievements and ripped them up and threw them out and put in his own in their place. And so I think, if those executive orders work near term, and they work if you have political continuity across administration to administration. But if any of your political continuity goes by the wayside, that's the first thing that gets ripped up and thrown out by the incoming president from the other side of the aisle. So I think you'll have President Trump probably do as much as he can within the bounds of the Constitution and his executive authority as possible to start the strategic Bitcoin reserve. I think he'll maybe try to sort of get at the seized Bitcoin that the U.S. government already has, and at minimum kind of put a no sale order on that. Maybe try to populate an actual reserve with keys held by the Treasury or the Treasury Department or some other government agency using that Bitcoin. But on the other side, you're going to need the parallel track of Congress, I think, because Congress will really put that long-term stability into any strategic Bitcoin reserve that we do decide to create. One of the nice things about Senator Lummis's act, which, as you and I were talking earlier, is really pretty well written for it just kind of being the first piece of legislation on this topic. And one of the nice things about it, though, is the 20-year statutory, what I call statutory HODL period, where the act requires any Bitcoin that is put into the Bitcoin reserve to be held by the Treasury Department for a minimum of 20 years. And when you think about what that means, I mean, Bitcoin is only 16 years old. So to put in a statutory holding period of 20 years, and it's gone from nothing, literally zero. And in fact, I would actually argue it's gone from negative dollars, because when it was first invented, it cost compute power and electricity to mine, and it was worth zero. So it was arguably a negative return, negative priced asset. And it's it's hit over $109,000 in 16 years. Fast forward that for another 20 years. I don't know if it can keep up that path, that sort of compound annual growth rate, but nevertheless, it has a lot of potential for upside over the next 20 years. And who knows what the Bitcoin world will look like then. I think I might need your help on what we would be at in terms of halving periods, but we're probably looking at well under 1 Bitcoin per block. I would argue, it might be like under 20 per day at that point, or 30 per day at that point. It's going to be a very small amount of Bitcoin created. So it'll be a completely different world, but ideally the U.S. will be looking back in 20 years saying, all right, let's put in another 20-year hold period on this, because this has been working out.
Yeah, it's, holding Bitcoin for 20 years is definitely going to probably create an immense amount of wealth, or obviously we're wrong.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that is a great point. I want to dive specifically more into the bill, like specifically Senator Lummis's proposed bill as it stands right now. Like how so I believe it's acquiring Bitcoin. Like how much Bitcoin would it be acquiring? And like how would it be financed? Do you know that?
Mhm. So the bill calls for 1 million Bitcoin over a period of 5 years. So they're looking to extract. I mean, we have lost Bitcoin and Satoshi's Bitcoin and all that, but let's just use even. Let's say there's 20 million Bitcoin. That's 5%, right, of the Bitcoin total supply. There's probably less than that active ever going to be out there, but that's what they're looking for. So they're looking to acquire a very sizable chunk, and I think they would only be surpassed in terms of total holdings at that point by Satoshi Nakamoto, him or herself. So a very large position, and it's 200,000 Bitcoin over every year for 5 years, essentially. I believe that the Marshal Service already owns around 200,000 Bitcoin just from various seizures. I think Silk Road and a couple others were alone enough to kind of bump up those numbers that high because it was very early on in early days in Bitcoin days. So, I think for the first year, there's nothing to say that there actually anything technically has to be bought if you could just move that over, find a legal mechanism to move that over to the strategic reserve. And, you've got your first year covered right there. And then you just have to acquire 800,000 more over the next 4 or 5 years. So, to the extent that they do purchase, because they will eventually have to purchase, they just don't have access to enough at this point to do it any other way, including through mining. So to the extent they do purchase, the bill suggests that a good chunk of that purchasing power will come from revaluing the gold certificates that the Federal Reserve banks currently hold. And the reason why that is important is because the the gold was statutorily valued at, I think, $42.22 per fine troy ounce back in 1973. There's a law passed by Congress saying this is how much an ounce of gold is worth. Since then, inflation, monetary policy, all that have caused gold to rise to nearly $3,000 per ounce. And so there's a huge gap there. And what the bill calls for is essentially having the Federal Reserve banks remit, having the Treasury Department issue new gold certificates to the existing gold that we have ownership over as a country for the current market value, and then have the Federal Reserve as almost like an accounting trick. There's a little bit there's a little vague in how it would actually be accomplished and carried out. The statute doesn't go into great detail there, but what it calls for is to have the Federal Reserve banks remit the difference to the Treasury Department. And so the way I look at that conceptually, and people may disagree as this being the correct kind of mental model used, but I conceptually look at that as us taking the results of the last 50 years or so of inflation and using that inflation over the last 50 years to purchase an asset like Bitcoin, which is disinflationary. And it's a pretty genius idea because nothing about that entails having to unload the underlying gold. You're using just the inflationary, the inflationary pressures over the last 50 years to help purchase Bitcoin, which I think is a pretty interesting idea, neat trick that Senator Lummis is working on.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it's not proposing to necessarily like sell the gold. The gold will still sit in Fort Knox or wherever it might sit if it exists, right? And then they would get some dollar IOUs from the Fed, effectively, maybe kind of like borrowing against their gold, maybe a potential way to frame it, or no?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know what it would be viewed as. It really seems like an accounting move from just to digitally transfer the value over, because it's just been valued so antithetical to what the market's valuing it at for so long that just by doing the trick of just valuing it at the market price creates all this additional accessible cash for the U.S. government that they can pull from.
How does the the upcoming crypto summit and like the executive orders that Trump has done to encourage like lawmakers to actually do research and try to understand like what's actually happening in the space. How does that tie into a potential strategic Bitcoin reserve? Like, is that obviously, is that going to make people like understand this and then encourage them to pass Senator Lummis's bill? Do you think that will like encourage them to come up with their own unique strategic crypto reserve instead? Like, how do you see that playing out?
Well, it's interesting. So the summit, I think the big thing that the summit does is it still allows stakeholders to talk to the president, talk to his team, and help them understand why Bitcoin is special. And then of course, if you're on the crypto side of things, why their cryptocurrency is special. It gives people a chance to educate. However much we might disagree with the arguments being made, they are able to be made in that function. And
Bitcoin is the ultimate scarce asset. Join Bitcoin macro expert Nick Bhatia at a live online event on March 17th for Death, Taxes, and 21 Million. Learn how to shield your wealth, leverage tax-advantaged accounts, and secure your Bitcoin for future generations. Your financial advisor, accountant, or attorney might not be up to speed on Bitcoin. Don't get caught off guard. Register now at unchained.com/21M. That's unchained.com/21M. And now back to the show.
That's, I think, a very good thing that you have a president receptive to those things and spending time. There's a million things going on in the world right now, and there's taking time to dedicate to this issue, which is very important to a sizable chunk of the electorate now. And it's very, very encouraging to see that. On top of that, though, I think what it really does too in DC circles is take this from what was once kind of a taboo, back alley discussion topic, like, you talk about it over drinks, maybe down at one of the K Street area bars or something like that, and say, yeah, I got some on Coinbase, something like that. But it wasn't serious policy discussion. Now there's very serious policy discussion going on. People can come out in support of it, and there's a kind of a weight lifted off of those who support it, that they can come out to talk to people openly about it and not be laughed out of the room, which I think is very, very important. And I think that's one of the big things that the summit and things like that do, is give politicians now an ability to say, here's a bill that I've been thinking about, or my staff's been cooking up for a while, and I didn't really want to put it out there, because you don't want to get your bills slapped down or laughed out of the room. Politics is the art of persuasion, so you want to be able to persuade folks. And if you're going to be laughed out of the room on your first big piece of legislation, it doesn't bode well for your future in the District of Columbia. So, having someone with real chops like the president, real political chops, the guy can muster 80 million votes, whatever it was, in support of himself. So having the ability to talk about it with him, and it takes some of that, I guess I would call it uneasiness that went along with talking about Bitcoin and crypto on the Hill, and allows you to do it more legitimately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I saw like Senator Cynthia Lummis was working more, or like right now they're working more on like a stable coin bill, I believe, and like they're trying to like gain some traction, like because that might be more, I guess, popular or easy to sell to all the other politicians and potentially get some momentum and then pass the strategic Bitcoin reserve. Have you heard similar things, or does that make sense? Like get something easy through the legislative process and then work on the Bitcoin reserve bill, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the same way, the fact that the subcommittee that Senator Lummis chairs on digital assets, that wants to make a name for itself as well. So again, it's brand new. It's never been tested before. You don't want to make a big play and lose big time, have your bill kicked out of committee or something like that, and when you're with your first big bill. So it makes sense that they're trying for a little more low-hanging fruit, something that there's probably a little more widespread agreement on. And also, the Genius Act, I think, is what you're referring to, which was to regulate stablecoins. That really is more within Congress's bailiwick. It's first of all, it's regulation, and they love doing that. So it's something that they're used to, and it's also quote unquote blockchain technology. But it's really the dollar, right? It's something that's trying to be a dollar proxy or a dollar equivalent. And so Congress, I think, would feel much more comfortable stepping into that area, because the dollar is sort of their area. that they feel very comfortable having control over. And so you can kind of get your first small sort of foray into Bitcoin, blockchain, cryptocurrency, whatever you want to call it, through this Genius Act. You get that through, and maybe you've got momentum to do the next thing. And the next thing could be the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve, or it could be, the reinvigoration of the former FIT 21 Act, or something similar along those lines. So it makes sense, I guess, that they're trying something that's really within their ambit, their usual ambit, to start things off, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Are you surprised with, how real this potential strategic Bitcoin reserve has become? Kind of like we mentioned at the start, Trump was negative to, at best, neutral in regards to Bitcoin, last presidency. Now we're literally talking about a strategic reserve on behalf of the United States of America. And at the same time, it's like, companies in the S&P 500 that hold Bitcoin, I think there's like two. It's like Tesla and Square. And they're not like on a Bitcoin standard by any means, like MicroStrategy. And then also it's like, if you walk around the street, your typical individual probably doesn't even hold any Bitcoin, let alone someone that's like adopted Bitcoin as like a strategic reserve and has it as a massive portion of their like personal net worth. Like, how is it so that are you surprised that like the United States is like potentially front running like everyone else?
Yeah, I am very surprised. And I also want to caution everyone that the fact that these things are being floated out there as possibilities does not necessarily mean that they're going to pass. And we don't really know what the appetite is on the Hill for Senator Lummis's bill. They may, even to the extent that they do accept it, they may chop it down significantly, say, let's go less than 1 million, let's do 100,000. We already have that, so we're good. So we don't really know what the appetite is for. But I will say I'm very surprised. And I remember having a conversation with you, I think it was on our last podcast that we did together, where you were saying, hey, I think we were talking about Bobby Kennedy's candidacy is when he was running. And you're saying, hey, do you think this is going to be a big issue for the campaign? And I was like, no, I don't think it's going to be a big issue for the campaign. I think it's probably at least another campaign out, maybe two, before it becomes mainstream. And I was very wrong on that. So, DC can move quickly. It's a very big ship, and it takes a long time to turn. But every now and then, it just surprises you. And it seems to be Bitcoin is one of those things where they're doing a lot more quickly than I thought they would. But I think that being said, there's probably a lot of expectation within the Bitcoin community, maybe even the broader crypto community, that this is all going to take place relatively soon. And I think maybe it would be best for us all to temper those expectations somewhat and enjoy the little wins along the way, because when you really look back 5 years ago, we were in a much different place from a regulatory perspective, political perspective, and Washington now has leadership that is completely on the other side, saying, hey, let's make this happen. Let's really look into this. Let's start these working groups. Let's introduce these bills. Let's see what happens. Let's create a whole new subcommittee within the Senate Banking Committee, and really look into this with some earnest. And that's very exciting in and of itself. So, yes, I am very surprised how quickly DC has responded. And I hope we continue to do this, but we make sure we get it done right. And, we celebrate the wins along the way, because we're in a very good spot right now.
Mm-hmm. What are the counter arguments to passing some sort of bill like this? Like, obviously, many of the Bitcoiners support this bill. Obviously, we would gain, personally from it, but obviously we would think the United States would gain, as a whole from doing the same thing that we're already doing personally. But then you also have people like Nick Carter, who recently published stuff saying like the United States should not have a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Like, what counter arguments do you see, or hurdles do you see when it comes to passing something like this?
Yeah, I mean, the hurdle really, the biggest hurdle I think is obviously the same one we face in our day-to-day lives when we talk to anyone we know outside of the industry about Bitcoin, and it's getting people to understand very difficult concepts like what is money, cryptography, and human sort of behavioral patterns, things like that, game theory. It's very, very complex. So always, talking about that and any level is difficult, let alone at a a political nationwide level. So that's your still, I think, remains your biggest hurdle. I've often said that I think a lot of times Bitcoin will just exist for long enough that it becomes, nobody really cares that, how it works necessarily, because it just works for so long. Kind of like, whenever you send an email or something like that, you don't really know the fundamental, most people don't really know the fundamentals of how that's executed, how it's secured and things like that, where all the stuff that goes in behind it, the pipes and the plumbing. But everyone uses it because it just works. It's great. And you send sensitive attachments that you believe they won't get sniffed and they won't be, spied on and things like that, because you're like, you know what, it seems to work pretty well. And I do think that'll happen with Bitcoin eventually, but it's still going to take plenty of time for that level of comfort to set in. As far as what Nick Carter was saying, though, I've seen a couple comments from him. One was that he thinks it's going to undermine the U.S. dollar for us to do that. I've heard that from a number of folks, and I really don't understand that criticism, because we have other strategic reserves. We have a gold strategic reserve, or at least we could talk about why we haven't audited that, but we claim to have a gold strategic reserve, and I don't think that particularly undermines the dollar. I think you buy a strategic reserve, or you stock a strategic reserve for a desirable thing that cannot be created at a whim, and that you want to kind of hoard for situations that you cannot account for, that difficult economic situations. And I think gold and Bitcoin are very similar in that regard. And Bitcoin, you're just being able to kind of do it a lot earlier than we were able to do with gold. And I don't see how that necessarily undermines faith in the U.S. dollar. I don't think the U.S. purchasing Bitcoin would suddenly devalue the dollar any more than printing money and increasing the M2 supply devalues the dollar. So I don't really understand that criticism. I guess the other one, though, that's pretty big that folks I think are understandably concerned about is, what if this doesn't work, right? What if the past performance does not play out into the future? And we're always saying that the compound annual growth rate, even in Bitcoin's lowest 5-year period, is beating the S&P 500 and all that. And it is entirely possible that for some reason Bitcoin doesn't work. I don't think that's likely to happen anymore. I think it's much less likely than to not happen than it is to happen. But it's still a outlier scenario that could definitely happen. And that's a very reasonable criticism. It's a reasonable kind of reason for hesitancy from folks. And that's why it's important to educate Congress on the risk profile of the asset, because there is a risk profile. We can't just pretend there's not. It is very much still up in the air whether Bitcoin will succeed long term. I think it will. I think most people who spend the time studying it and understanding it come to that conclusion as well. I think a lot of the criticisms are from folks that don't spend enough time studying it and understanding it. But that's why we have to educate Congress and have our elected officials together decide that this is a good investment, and this is an investment that's worth the level of risk, because the upside is very high. And you get that critical consensus, and then it's that's part of why it's good to be in a democratic republic, because the voters get their say through their elected officials. And if for some reason the voters are dissatisfied with that decision, they'll make the elected officials know it. And that's just the nature of any decision that any political body makes. And so I understand the hesitancy, but I think it's also something that we can address and hedge against. I mean, just the way you do with any other political decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find the argument of the United States should not buy and acquire Bitcoin and hold it for decades strange, especially when it comes from people that are holding a lot of Bitcoin, right? Like, because it's like, if the world is adopting Bitcoin as a new premier store of value asset, I'd rather the United States buy it before China sell all of their treasuries and buy a lot of Bitcoin, or Russia or whoever. And it's like, if Bitcoin exists and it is a better store of value asset, then that might just be like inevitable that's going to happen. So like, maybe we should do that before everyone else does.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what, while I don't understand the argument that the U.S. purchasing Bitcoin somehow undermines the U.S. dollar, I certainly understand the argument that everyone else purchasing Bitcoin undermines the US dollar if the US doesn't have it. And so we need to hedge not just against buying Bitcoin as a nation. We need to hedge against not buying Bitcoin as a nation. I mean, they're like, if we decide not to do this and the other nations do, they are going to devalue our dollar. They're not going to consider it valuable when they have their own parallel financial system to use. So we're in a position now as a country where we can make an investment in purchasing Bitcoin, take a sizable percentage of the overall supply for a reasonable price, even at today's prices, which we all think are crazy. But everybody always thinks the price that they're at today is crazy, and then 3 years later they're saying, "Oh my God, I wish I got in 4 or 5 years ago, or I wish I got in 10 years ago." To the U.S. government, these prices are, we spend money on a lot of dumb things as a country, and this is something that we could spend money on that would help preserve our capacity as a world leader in the event that, for some reason, for the likely reason that other monies or other countries see that Bitcoin is a superior form of money and they want access to it too. So I think we need to be very cognizant of that fact and consider the ramifications of us turning our back on something that other countries are going to see as a way to kind of knock down the U.S. a few pegs.
Yeah, it's almost like it's some sort of economic Manhattan Project where, if the United States had decided to never build a nuclear bomb, whether you like nuclear bombs or not, like they exist, and if foreign adversaries, developed thousands of nuclear warheads and we perpetually were like, no, we're never going to do this, then that puts us in a, not great position.
Yeah.
And it's like
head in the sand strategy, as the world superpower, the head in the sand strategy is only going to knock you out of that slot. You cannot just maintain it forever by being static and stagnant. You have to look at the future and adapt towards it. Otherwise, you're going to lose your place as the number one country in the world.
Mm-hmm. We also have the potential like sovereign wealth fund idea that Trump has proposed, and I think like Howard Lutnick and one other guy are going to help lead that initiative. How does that, how are you thinking about that, and like how does that relate to the strategic Bitcoin reserve?
I mean, I think it's an interesting idea. I think it's kind of like would be more of a side project to a strategic Bitcoin reserve, because I look at like a sovereign wealth fund as more of an investment vehicle with potentially near-term investment reasons and things like that. I don't know what their plan for something like that is, but it's under a similar umbrella. Like the idea is very similar, but I don't know if it's something that they're going to want to hold for 20 years or for 40 years, the way we look at maybe a strategic Bitcoin reserve, where this is our new gold reserve, and we want to just put it away. We want to multi-sig it and separate the keys and forget about it for 40 years. I don't know if that's sort of the same concept with the sovereign wealth fund. If it is, then I think it's a great complement to it, and it's a great way to maybe kind of get at the same idea, just using a different vehicle to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm curious to see like the debate over like the sovereign wealth fund in the future and what people think. Like to some extent, like I think it's a good idea, like to bring critical industries back to America. But then I also think that like you don't want the government owning every business and every industry. Like that's effectively communism to some extent.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean that's a good point, to the extent that they're using a sovereign wealth fund to purchase stocks and everything, that just anything that has value, that is not really in line with the long-term American ethos that we've had, where the government is of limited nature. It has its certainly today it's expanded its authority a great deal from where we originally envisioned it, but nevertheless, by purchasing private companies, equity stakes in private companies, going beyond just commodity purchases and things like that, then we're really getting into a point where it's almost I don't want to call it crony capitalism, but it's a area that the government probably should stay out of, and that we have historically stayed out of, because we respect private enterprise, the distinct roles of private enterprise and the federal government.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I feel like it kind of makes sense. Like Bitcoin is like the perfect solution here. It's like we have this, like, for some reason, massive privilege, since the dollar is a world reserve currency, to just spend recklessly. We don't really know what to buy. We don't really want to buy our own companies because that's not necessarily the best thing to do. Well, maybe we should buy the new form of money that the world is about to go to, but no one recognizes yet.
Yeah.
And then we, if we have the dollar as a world money, we'll have Bitcoin as a world money, and we'll own a lot of Bitcoin.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the one thing I mention when people say, oh, the American taxpayers shouldn't fund strategic Bitcoin reserve. And, it's not fair because it pumps the bags of Bitcoin holders. And my response is a strategic Bitcoin reserve is the easiest way to get 330 million Americans exposure to Bitcoin in a way that they never would have previously. So you have to really kind of look at it through that lens. It's not about pumping, early adopters bags. It's about getting the American people exposure to the best form of money that's ever been created.
Yeah, definitely. What about the state strategic reserve that are in progress? Like there's, many bills that are all over the country, right, that have been, in progress to some extent. Some have been rejected. You have like Georgia and Texas that I think might be making good progress. What have you been seeing on that front? Yeah,
so I think Utah, there's a great service called, you've probably seen it, bitcoinlaws.io. They track all of the Bitcoin bills around the country, and I've just been following it kind of along myself, and they show, I think that Utah's actually out in front. I think they're in their second chamber. So they've passed one chamber of their state legislature already, and they're on to the next. I have not looked at the Utah bill. And a lot of times these bills are pretty modest in what they do. So, we call it a strategic Bitcoin reserve bill, but it's saying, let's form a study committee and let's make a plan to make a law to purchase it later, essentially. And so, it's again, you celebrate the small wins for sure. But a lot of times these are modest bills. And so I looked at Texas, for example, and they just passed SB. I'm not sure what the Senate said. I have SB 21. I'm not sure if that's the right number, but they passed that out of the Senate Business and Commerce Committee 10-0 in a bipartisan committee. So, I mean, that's got Democrats, Republicans on it. And everybody voted for it. There was one abstention, I think, or one person who was not there to vote. But I think that's, it's a really positive sign overall. It's not, I didn't see anything in it. Like if you look at the federal Bitcoin counterpart, there's, all these specific terms, like how much we're going to buy, when we're going to buy it by, how we're going to fund it, how long we have to hold it for. There's a lot of very, very strong particulars in there. And this is more, an idea to get it's the vehicle to get the appropriations to purchase, an amount of Bitcoin in the future. And that's not necessarily because they can't get the critical mass of support within the Texas legislature. It may just be a function of how the appropriations process works in Texas. Georgia's got its own appropriations process. You have to budget these things, and a lot of times you can't budget for something and purchase it in the same session, in the same General Assembly session. So you got to wait till the next session and then vote on that budget, and then you can go ahead and purchase it. So, as I said, these things take a while. Politics is a long game, and we have very high expectations for when we want things done, but we also count ourselves as low time preference folks. So politics can often be the ultimate low time preference sport. So I hope people show some patience and see that these things are good, that they're happening, and they're getting the support that they need, and the wheels are in motion. And Texas is showing that because they have two bills. Both of which are strong starting points and hopefully will lead to a purchase of Bitcoin. I think the second bill allows for a purchase of up to 1% of whatever's in the Texas General Fund. So Texas is a large state. That could be a pretty sizable allocation. But again, as we talked about, it's about balancing the risk, right? We want people to get involved with this, but we don't want to scare people off by saying let's go all in on this, and 50% of our surplus fund goes to Bitcoin. I think doing it in a essentially the state equivalent of a dollar cost averaging way is probably the most prudent way to go about it. And in states that are like Texas and Georgia, really any state, it's going to be a sizable chunk of money going into purchasing Bitcoin. So really, you see 1%, 2%, and you don't think that's much, but it's a meaningful amount.
Yeah. Do you know how these state-based bills are getting started? Like, is it, like the Satoshi Action Fund that's kind of knocking on people's doors and saying like, hey, can you pass this bill? Is it like another entity, or like just, individuals in each state's like contacting their local representative and saying like, hey, like, can you make a strategic Bitcoin reserve? Like, it just seems interesting that it's gotten so much traction, at least to get started throughout like the official legal process.
Yeah, I don't have any particular insight on how these are beginning in most states. I know that Bitcoin Policy Institute and folks like that, as you mentioned, Satoshi Action Fund, I believe, does some work in this space, and they're there kind of doing the policy lobbying work and trying to, that involves going to their offices and talking to them. Sometimes that involves donations. Sometimes that involves, inviting them to events where they get, they get a lot of not support, but folks coming to see them, and they get a lot of eyes on their campaign and things like that. So there's a lot of different ways it can happen. But one of the things I think that's happening and why it's happening quickly is because the Bitcoin policy sort of wing of the Bitcoin community is getting its act together and spending the time and the money in DC and in the state houses that we probably didn't do 5 or 10 years ago necessarily, or certainly not at the scale that we're doing it at now. And so that's typically how these things get going. I think you could always have that impassioned senator who just loves Bitcoin, or that impassioned representative that just loves Bitcoin. And I think to some degree, Senator Lummis is that way. She does seem to be, a genuine believer. She seems to be actually involved in it. And so you do get that every now and then. But a lot of times, too, it's just getting out there and knocking on office doors and saying, hey, do you have a few minutes? Let's talk about Bitcoin.
Yeah. Yeah. Senator Lummis, from my perspective, seems to be like so far ahead of probably all of her peers at this point.
Yeah. And I almost don't envy her position there on Capitol Hill, because it's like, we all as Bitcoiners understand what it's like to talk to our quote unquote normie friends and colleagues and try to explain this stuff and advocate for it. I can only imagine that's true at a massive scale on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, 100%. I definitely agree. How about SAB or SAB 121, like the ability, I guess, for banks to custody Bitcoin and provide Bitcoin financial services in a fair way, I guess, from how it was before. Is that a really big deal or not? How do you think about it?
I think it's fairly significant. As I understand it, SAB 121, what it required was, if you were a financial institution and you wanted to acquire and custody, or you wanted to custody 1,000 Bitcoin on behalf of your clients or something like that, not only did you have to maintain the 1,000 Bitcoin as a matter of prudence, so you don't get a run on your Bitcoin, but you also needed a one-to-one sort of cash or cash equivalent level to backstop that, and you need to do that. So it was really just kind of cost prohibitive for anyone to get in, because you'd have to essentially double the liability that you had on your balance sheet in order to comply with the rule. And I think SAB 122 essentially rescinded that and put it under a more normal level of liability protection for custodying the assets, and it made it much more easy and reasonable for folks that are in the financial institution world to say, hey, we can offer this service to our clients now. So you don't, because I think it was essentially cost prohibitive for a financial institution to custody Bitcoin on behalf of their clients, because it just required too much backing, cash and cash equivalent backing to the actual asset that you were custodying. Mm-hmm. And so I think the net effect of that will be, you start to see traditional financial institutions look into that side of the business and saying that they're, they want a chance to custody assets and make fees on stuff like that. So it'll just open the door to more players into the industry, and more regulated players too.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. How about Operation Choke Point? Obviously, that was a huge thing during the previous administration, and it kind of came to light, over the last year or so. Is that officially dead?
It sounds like there's very little appetite for it anymore. There's certainly no appetite for it in the administration. And as I mentioned, I think at the beginning of this podcast, the Trump administration is taking the view that the federal agencies need to be directly responsive to the executive branch, the political branch. And so if that's the case, then they will they will quash any sort of Operation Choke Point 2.0 that's going on very quickly. That being said, though, it's administration to administration, right? So I think the hearings in Congress that are happening right now are important to continue to kind of expose and shed light on this so it doesn't happen again. I think Caitlin Long's Custodia Banks lawsuit out in Wyoming that is kind of challenging these things and getting information as a result of that lawsuit and the discovery process. I think that's very important too, to get court rulings and essentially slapping this concept down, because the idea that entirely lawful businesses can be dissuaded from engaging in an entirely lawful business practice because it's disfavored by someone in Congress or someone in the White House is very problematic. And I don't want to say that it's happening, but from what we see from industry participants, it all seems like it's happening according to them. And so it needs to stop, because it's not the function of our government to pick winners and losers and shut out people from running legal businesses that may be a little more risky, but nevertheless are entirely legal.
Given everything that we've talked about today, or maybe even something that we haven't talked about potentially, what do you think is like your biggest prediction for the rest of 2025 that, people should be aware of?
Okay, and I want to remind you of my prediction about Robert F. Kennedy's and Bitcoin being a part of the 2024 campaign. So I'm not always great at this, but I think 2025 will see a state pass a strategic Bitcoin reserve bill in the 2025 legislative session. I think there'll be at least one. I don't know how sweeping it'll be. As I said, they can often be quite modest, but it'll set the tone for states going forward. And it also signal to the U.S. government that there are going to be other buyers potentially ahead of you. So perhaps it's a good idea to get moving on your bill as well.
Yeah. Related to that, like, what do you think is the biggest catalyst to states actually doing some sort of strategic Bitcoin reserve and the federal government? And like, I guess specifically related to price, like if price is going up a lot, does that make these bills more likely to pass because like nations experience a fear of missing out as well as individuals, or is it better, like, would the government be more likely to pass it if the price drops a lot, or would they be like, this is stupid, it died again, why would we buy it? Like, how does price play a role in, do you think, the legislative process?
I think that nation states are just collections of people, and people experience FOMO, and nation states will have it too. I think it's actually a lot harder to push Bitcoin when it's going down, even though it's much more financially prudent to purchase it then, because people, again, a lot of people don't understand it. So the price is the really easiest way to look at it and go, oh, maybe there's something to this because the price keeps going up. It's a very, very easy way to kind of give yourself a little confirmation bias that you're making the right call, and you go ahead and pull the trigger. When it's going down, if you haven't done the work, then you're going to say there's your confirmation bias saying you were right to not buy it. So I think I think a catalyst will be price going up, much more likely than price going down, unless you've got some serious, true believers in your legislative chamber. I'll also say another catalyst is some states have big surpluses. Some states have very big budget surpluses, and like MicroStrategy back in 2020 when they said we've got a couple $100 million in cash on hand, we see inflation happening, we don't know what to do with it, and Michael Saylor took the long trip down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and came out saying we need to buy Bitcoin. I think there's meaningful likelihood that will occur on the state level eventually as well, because as inflation continues, even modest inflation doesn't have to be hyperinflation or what we saw in 2021, 22 when it was at like 8-9%. We're all kind of aware now that our money, to quote your report, your wealth is melting, and I think everyone's either, whether they realize it or not, they're aware of that fact. And I think with states with large surpluses, like Georgia, I think has 20 billion in surplus right now, and we got to find something to do with it. It can't just sit in the bank because it will melt away over time. And Bitcoin will increasingly be looked at as a way to protect at least small portions of that wealth. And so I think states will look at that and say, hey, we need to get going on this.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that's actually been talked about, it's probably unlikely, or maybe it's not, I don't know. But I think at least it's a rumor, is no capital gains tax on Bitcoin. Like, is that within the realm of possibility, or is that just like complete nonsense? And then related to that, another out there thing that's been talked about is like repealing the income tax. Like, is that possible, or is that just like never going to happen in a million years?
So capital gains tax first. That seems more likely than the income tax probably. But like again, these require, for the most part, these really do require an act of Congress. I know folks are saying, oh, well, you can just not enforce the law, but nevertheless, not enforcing the law doesn't make it legal to not follow the law. So people who don't pay their taxes, even when they're not, even for a period of time when they're not being enforced, they may still be on the hook for paying their taxes. Maybe not criminally liable for it, but they may still be, monetarily liable down the road because they failed. Like the failure to enforce the law was not consistent with the law. And another administration come in and say, we need to get these taxes accounted for. Especially if you're in the wealthy bracket, they're not going to shed many tears over those folks not paying not paying taxes for 5 years or whatever it will be. So to the extent that you do this, it really does need to be done through an act of Congress, and I think you're going to have a hard time getting the critical mass to do that. However, in Trump's style of art of the deal, where he makes an outrageous ask and then they kind of settle for the middle, maybe you say, all right, we're repealing income taxes, and then you settle for capital gains tax repeal, and everybody's happy with that, and the capital gains tax gets repealed. I don't know if you ever get that just isolated to just Bitcoin, unless maybe it's reclassified as a currency, in which case I don't think it's subject to capital gains taxes, but it's certainly going to be a challenge. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, no, that's reasonable. One more question I had on the strategic reserve actually is, you had Brian Armstrong and the Winklevoss twins actually made comments that I thought were kind of interesting, where they said basically altcoins should not be part of a strategic reserve. When Trump had kind of said like he wants Solana and XRP and Cardano or whatever else in the strategic reserve. Did you find that interesting? Like owners or CEOs of large crypto exchanges were saying you should only acquire Bitcoin in a strategic reserve.
Yeah, I did. I was actually a little surprised by that. I didn't necessarily think they'd come out in support of adding XRP or Solana, but I didn't think they would be vocal about keeping it only Bitcoin. So that was a very pleasant surprise. But it does make sense. I mean, as I said, the Capitol Hill is not an area that has historically been very receptive to this industry, and we are playing with the big boys now, and we don't really want to start bringing in these casino coins and make us all look bad, essentially, and cut and take the rug out from under whatever momentum we are able to garner. So like Bitcoin has been around 16 years. It is really, it is showing that S-curve adoption level. While it's volatile short term, it's great as a long-term bet. The same cannot be said for these other coins. I mean, you look at the XRP chart and it looks like a pump and dump coin. No offense to the XRP army, but it has massive swings up and then it goes down and plateaus. Same thing with Solana. Solana's new. Solana's so new. It hasn't been tested, and when it has been tested, it's failed the test a number of times. They've had issues with that, and you can just go on and on. And so these coins are not ready for prime time. And look no further than all the strategic Bitcoin reserve bills, or they even call them strategic crypto reserve bills. Sometimes they say the minimum threshold for getting in is at least a $500 billion market cap for over the last 12 months, for a rolling period of 12 months. Sometimes it's 750 billion, sometimes it's $1 trillion. But none of those there's not a single coin that meets that margin or meets that bar besides Bitcoin. And there's a reason for that, because it's been around the longest. It's got the staying power, and it is the only adult in the crypto room. So I do agree with those exchange founders that let's stick to Bitcoin. Let's not go crazy. We're asking a big ask here, and let's do it responsibly. I'm sure they'll come out, in a few years saying, "Oh, let's start adding a few new." But I'll take what I can get from them, and I appreciate their input on that topic.
Yeah, I appreciate it too. It's almost like they're kind of admitting that they just have a bunch of casino coins on their online casino, and they're like, "Wait, before the U.S. government actually buys a lot of this." You should buy the right thing.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. And I mean, that's their business model. And like I said, it's a perfectly lawful business model right now. I mean, that you could make the securities argument if you want to, but if it's a lawful business, even if I disagree with it, I don't go to casinos very often, or if I do, I know I'm going to lose my money. And I mean, that just is what it is. And they're still allowed to make money on that business model. And I think that's totally fine. And I think that's true of the exchanges as well. But yeah, don't put it in what's strategic about something that, a corporation just invented out of thin air, gave to itself, and then started selling. It just doesn't make a great deal of sense to me.
Yeah. 2 more questions and we'll close it out. What's something that you believe that other Bitcoiners disagree with?
Something that I believe that other Bitcoiners disagree with. Voting matters. Voting is very important. I think in Bitcoin land, up until recently, everyone sort of was very dismissive of voting. It was very defeatist and apathetic. And I think that this election showed you that voting matters, even at the federal level. And it's an important thing to do because these elections do have consequences. It's a cliche that everyone always says, "Oh, it's the most important election of our lives." Everybody always says that, and that's not always true. But I don't think that we should dismiss that as an industry, and I think this last election shows exactly why that is. Yes, President Trump has not done everything that I would like. I mean, I don't love the meme coin launches and all that, but he's making it much, much easier for this industry and for Bitcoin specifically to thrive. And it's nice to have some tailwinds for once instead of regulatory headwinds.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at least like relating to Bitcoin, it probably was the most important election involving Bitcoin, at least.
Oh my God, yeah. The alternative would have been a very, very tough regulatory environment. I think Bitcoin would have been just fine. I don't know if the prices would be where it is, but I think it's Corey Clipston that said, don't it's something about don't fight the war if you don't have to. Kind of avoid the war if you can, and I think that's what voting in 2024 allowed us to do, is avoid a very costly and protracted war with the regulatory apparatus that was in place.
Last question. What do you think is the biggest risk to Bitcoin?
Biggest risk to Bitcoin? I don't want to say quantum computing because I don't think it's an actual risk, but it's what the advent of a very strong, basically breaking SHA-256, the ability to break SHA-256 or elliptic curve digital signature algorithm. Either one of those two things presents a technical risk that will have to be dealt with. And the way it's not that those underlying things happening are the biggest risk, it's what they create. And the biggest risk will be the inevitable way of dealing with them. It's actually could split the community in a way that is difficult to recover from. So if we don't hit that inflection point just right, and with a good deal of consensus, I think it's a big risk to Bitcoin. That being said, the block size wars were the first iteration of that, and it was not hit with the most grace, that inflection point. But nevertheless, Bitcoin did just fine, right? And so it survives a lot of things, but I do think that the ultimate, reaction of the community dealing with sort of the kind of drumbeat of technological process over the next 10, 20, 30 years will be challenging, and we have to make sure we do it right. And there are potentially existential risks for Bitcoin associated with that.
Yeah, that was a good answer. Well, Bryan, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We covered a lot of ground in an hour or so this was fantastic. Where can the audience go learn more about you and what you do?
I am on X with my name there. Bryan Jacoutot is my profile. I am an attorney for a law firm called Clark Hill, and we have an Atlanta office. We're also based all around the country and in Ireland and Mexico. And we have a new offering called Clark Hill Economics, in which I am a senior director, and I'm writing policy position papers on Bitcoin and doing economic research on Bitcoin industry more broadly. So if you ever have any need for that as an industry or an organization, please let me know. Other than that, I am on LinkedIn.
I love it. Well, that was great. Well, thanks again. This was fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved it. Let's do it again.